people have been arguing about. And actually, I'll give away at least my personal opinion here at the top. There is no clear-cut answer to me of which one of these 5 answers could or should be correct. Then for context, because probably not everybody here thinks about the United Nations all the time, we're living in a world of big environmental problems. And so policymakers, decision makers that we elect all around the world are trying to solve them. So for example, I'm a child of the 80s. If you look down here, we were all worried about sunscreen. If you lived in Australia, oh my God, you know, huge problems. So the ozone layer is not a problem anymore. Why? Because in 1987, there was the Montreal Protocol to stop that bad stuff from going up there and busting open the ozone. So these are good things. We can't forget, we're really trying to solve big problems. Then if you flash forward to the early 90s, to Earth Day and to the Rio Summit, there are 3 major conventions that are open for signature: the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UNFCCC for climate change, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. Now, everybody knows about climate change, right? That's Glasgow, that's Paris, that's Kyoto, that's all of that stuff actually got started back here in 1992. Now, for those of us that work in CBD, we consider ourselves the poor stepchild of these 3 conventions, although actually desertification is honestly less known. But this is where I want to zoom in for the first 10 to 15 slides here. So the Convention on Biological Diversity got opened for signatures, ratification in 1992. And it basically has 3 relatively easy to understand goals, although the first 2 are probably the most intuitive. Number 1, the conservation of biological diversity, right? This is kind of like the ozone example. We don't want species to die out. Panda, whale, big stuff, little stuff. Let's keep it because it's good for the planet. Number 2, when we use it, let's not use all of it. Let's just use a little bit at a time so that we have it for forever, ideally. Then number 3 is probably the least intuitive, and maybe the one that you've never even thought about, which is the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits from the use of genetic resources. So there's basically 2 ideas here. Number 1, this should act as a type of financing mechanism to help to support the first 2, meaning that users of biodiversity should share back benefits with the countries of origin when they do this. Secondly, this is also a political balancing act. In order to ask all the countries of the world, hey, stop using your rainforest unsustainably, then there has to be a give back, a trade-off made for the other countries to do something, namely enforcing their users to share back benefits with said countries. And ultimately, the concept of sovereign rights, which was actually established in the late 70s, gets very firmly entrenched in the CBD to say they have rights over biodiversity. Every country can decide, just like with oil, gas, and minerals, which is sort of intuitive already, that you cannot go into a country's borders and take and use its biological diversity without asking permission. Again, perhaps not surprisingly, but maybe as a biologist, not something that you intuitively knew or thought about. So for about 30 years, parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and other fora that began negotiating in parallel after the CBD mainly focused on access to physical stuff, to biological material, to what was called genetic resources. I use the term biological resources because I think it makes more sense, but actually the term of art and policy is genetic resources. So I work at a collection. We have the most microbiological diversity in our basement, with 80% of all bacterial species and many species of fungi, archaea, human and animal cell lines. And because we send and receive things to 86 countries around the world, we've had, since we've existed, kept a very close eye on these policy processes. And when there were further developments here in 2010, we became very actively engaged and sort of stopped kind of watching it out of a side eye and very actively became engaged in the process. And that is the 2010 Nagoya Protocol. So between 1992 and 2010, there were calls to say, hey, you know, we made this deal on the 3rd objective, right, on fair and equitable benefit sharing, but it ain't happening. Why are there no benefits flowing back? And so the solution to that was the 2010 Nagoya Protocol, which basically creates a new level of legal compliance and legal binding agreement to enforce that original 1992 agreement. So long story short, if you or anybody that you know are using biological material, non-human, so everything that's not human, not us, you need to follow the national access and benefit sharing laws of the country that you've taken or that your stuff comes from. Utilization is defined very broadly. Many people make the mistake that they think it's only about commercial use, but actually there is no exclusion of non-commercial or academic use. And genetic resources is basically everything but humans, so plants, animals, fungi, microbes, including biochemical compounds, including the molecules, the physical molecules of DNA and RNA. What, however, was left unsaid is what about the data? This doesn't get resolved at all in this 2010 agreement. Importantly, here within the European Union, we make a difference in our implementing regulation, which is Regulation 511, between the national access laws where each member state can decide, do they make rules about the stuff in their borders or not? They get to choose, versus all member states, all 27 member states, plus the UK at the time before Brexit, saying we will all measure compliance in the same way. I know there's a lot of Brits out there. But actually, what you did with Brexit, like with a lot of other EU regs, is you just copied and pasted the EU regulation into your books. And so actually, we do it the same way. That wasn't actually a joke. You really did. But okay. Anyway. So basically what this means is that parties agree, and this is very unusual for a sovereign country, is they will enforce the national laws of another country, right? So in Germany, we enforce the rules of South Africa, of Argentina, because we're party to the Nagoya Protocol. All member states, including here in France, would check user compliance. Researchers here in Europe have to file a due diligence declaration. And then there was also this voluntary compliance mechanism, which is called the Register of Collections, of which my institute became the first to register itself because of the volume of our international role. I could spend another 30 minutes talking about physical samples in the Nagoya Protocol, but I won't do that here at a computational biology. Instead, I'm going to transition now into, sorry, no, I'm going to actually give you 2 slides, apologies. Just a very simple idea of what access and benefit sharing is, and it kind of came up on the 2 slides ago, which is that access basically means asking for permission before you take something. And the important thing, benefit sharing, which I haven't mentioned yet, is giving something back. So often for non-commercial researchers, this looks like joint research collaborations, co-authorships, trainings, in-kind support, or even it could come to joint intellectual property. And ultimately, in theory, all of that should contribute back to conservation and sustainable use, to the first 2 objectives of the CBD. The problem, however, with the Nagoya Protocol that arose relatively quickly is that the procedure for compliance is not intuitive at all. In fact, it's quite administratively complex. And most importantly, the fact that every country has sovereign rights means every country can choose how its national laws work. And there are no rules, effectively, for what you do when it's not clear how those laws work. So what you're supposed to do is go to an international website run by the CBD called the ABS Clearinghouse. You're supposed to look up an email address of a person in that country, email them and say, how do I get a permit to work with your stuff? And then if they don't answer and you're a European user, then you're stuck. You're in the middle of, you have to comply, but you have no answer. And that could go on for months like that, or they could send you back a form and then you fill out the form and then you send it back and then they don't answer. And that happens actually with a lot of different countries that are in various levels of implementation, and creates a lot of disenfranchisement on both sides, both countries feeling like, hey, they're getting taken advantage of, and users feeling like, hey, you're not really serious because the system's not working. And it is that experience that has also led to a lot of tension and frustration. In fact, you can even see this here in Europe, some of the exceptions and some of the variability in implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. So for example, the United States, which is a really big country, is not a party to the Nagoya Protocol. So they neither enforce nor do they govern their own genetic resources in that way. So big open economic marketplace there. Nagoya Protocol parties may also give free access to their genetic resources, meaning you create an incentive to use from countries where it's easy. So look at how much green there is here in the European Union versus how much red. So if you go to France or Spain, you need to follow national laws. You go a little bit farther over and you have nothing to do at all. So this has created a lot of unevenness. Additionally, there are 2 other multilateral instruments under the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, as well as the World Health Organization, where there are certain organisms that are taken out of the system, namely 63 staple crops, as well as pandemic influenza, although no other species of viruses, only pandemic influenza, which was a bit of an unfortunate thing when coronaviruses, came into being the last few years. And then also up until March of this year, international waters, meaning beyond 200 nautical miles offshore and excluding exclusive economic zones, were also completely free access. You could do whatever you wanted. So this, those are the international waters. So this, let's say, patchwork landscape of rules created over 20 years a lot of acrimony, a lot of political frustration on both sides. And basically, nobody could deny that access and benefit sharing was not working, was not delivering, was not compensating or balancing out the first two objectives of the CBD. And so the political argument that was posed in Cancun in 2013 was, hey, you know what the problem is? The reason this isn't working is because of digital piracy. Because you smart scientists, you figured out there are open access databases, and now you have all these fancy synthetic biology tools. Don't forget CRISPR, Nobel Prize, very, very high profile. You can do all these things without having to come into our countries. And so, of course, access and benefit sharing isn't delivering because everybody's just avoiding the system. There's a loophole in the system. And to a certain extent, this is true. I mean, the fundamental availability of biological data and new tools is changing biology, although I would argue it's definitely not that simple. And in addition, there was the accusation of the presumption that this was a one-way street, that it was the scientists in the North exploiting the data from the South, and that is, I think, fundamentally false. And in fact, a group of us got together to sort of say the use of DSI, the use of digital sequence information or of the public open access sequence databases is actually far more complex. And that's what I'd like to tell you about today for a few slides. So the hypothesis of ABS is developing countries provide access to biodiversity that developed country scientists use and profit from this biodiversity. And we called this in the paper the provider-user dichotomy. Of course, it's an oversimplification, but that's sort of the fundamental premise of a lot of the CBD. So what we did was to take the 9 million sequences that are in ENA or in the INSTC databases that actually have country of origin information available for them. That's not where stuff was sequenced. That's actually where the sample originally came from. Then we linked the 118,000 open access scientific publications from EPMC that cited that data, and then we published both the technical and the policy analysis of this data set. So this would look like this. You would have an open access publication on some new virus, let's say. Then you would have author affiliations, you would mine them, and you would say, okay, you know, Mr. Ted Cruz or Christopher Cruz, he was based in Peru at the time that he wrote this. So, you know, we call that the location of the user is Peru. And then in the sequence, he or she would cite sequences with accession numbers that are readable through the EPMC API. And then you can look those up and say, okay, what country did they come from using the country metadata field, Brazil. Okay, so then in this example, you would say the providing country is Brazil. That's where the sequence was, where the genetic resource came from that then turned into online sequence data. And the using country is the location of the author or authors. So if you do that for all that data set, you can start to generate network graphs like these, and you can see basically that it's a mess. But the mess is actually good, because the message to policymakers based on this mess is that Colombian scientists are using sequence data from 75 other countries. And there is no pattern to say they're only in Colombia, or they're only in Latin America, or they're only in the Americas. In fact, those dots are all over the place. And similarly, countries around the world are using Colombian DSI, meaning they're also coming from all over the world. And in fact, these numbers are roughly sort of a similar scale. So it's not necessarily this one-way street that Colombia is being taken advantage of, but rather that's a very complex and dynamic interaction, which is perhaps what we would expect and hope for. And if you take those numbers for all countries in the world, you can graph them on an XY axis, and you can see that the relationship between providing and using data is actually quite tightly coupled. So on the x-axis, you see using of DSI from a given country, from X country like Colombia, and then the provision, meaning I'm giving access to my genetic resources, and then it turns into sequence data. And perhaps most importantly, from looking at all of these data, the colored dots, G77 is a placeholder for low-income countries, BRICS is middle-income countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and OECD is high-income countries, just to sort of label the data points. But perhaps most importantly, both for the upper left and for the upper right, there are no countries that are only using DSI, right? So like Germany is not only taking advantage of the open system and we are not giving anything back. Or similarly, there are no countries that are only providing and not also profiting from the system. So of course, there are dots that are really low, meaning their overall providing and usage is low, and that's not what we want. I think, as a global scientific community, but yet there's not this exploitation there. And so the story is in fact much more complicated. And in fact, if you group this by the traditional United Nations groups, so the UN policymakers negotiate in blocks, in geographical blocks, so Eastern Europe, the African group, Latin America, the Western Europe, and the Asian Pacific. And you can see, for example, if you go to Latin America here, GRULAC, you can see if the country of origin, the source of the genetic material, originally came from Latin America, that the portion of users matches that, meaning the red is the biggest portion. So GRULAC users use GRULAC sourced DSI the most. I'm seeing the Argentinian colleague nodding. This is perhaps not surprising, but actually for policymakers, this blows their mind, right? Because this is actually not the original sort of rhetoric of the talk. Of course, you can see that the height of the bars is disturbing, right? Asia Pacific, Western Europe. So the amount and the volume of use with these genetic resources is higher. And in fact, it's exactly that bars I would argue that you want to increase, is the amount of use of that, rather than to hold that back by sort of locking that data down underneath sovereign rights, meaning it will get used less. And it was this recognition that this is an international problem that led us about 2 years ago, or coming up on 3, in fact, to found an outreach network called the DSI Scientific Network, in which we've brought together, at this point, over 80 members from 28 countries on every inhabited continent to do policy outreach on this, to sort of say what's important to us as a scientific community is open access. What is important is the system isn't fair and that benefit sharing needs to happen, but that it shouldn't break the existing scientific ecosystem, but should be built off of that. It's a complex message to deliver, but the goal of this network and the outreach that we do is to try to find a middle ground and to offer win-win compromises. We made a real effort to publish this in the peer-reviewed literature, to propose a policy solution amongst 41 authors from, at that time, just 17 countries, to sort of say open access is critical and that the CBD has an opportunity to find a solution that is in the multilateral space, meaning not doing it like the Nagoya Protocol did it on a bilateral basis, meaning every country gets to decide how it makes rules about DSI, but a standardized, internationally harmonized set of rules is what we need. And we tried to summarize that with 5 principles that we called a win-win solution, which boil down to open access, a simple system, a harmonized system that's compatible with other treaties like WHO, like FAO, and BBNJ, which I'm going to get to, that it is supportive of the broader biodiversity goals, and ultimately that the role of the databases is not to police national laws, but rather to use them for transparency, to provide data into the global biodiversity framework as perhaps an indicator to show the system how and whether or not fairness and equity are being addressed, but not to use them as policemen or policewomen. So what is perhaps the most important take-home message for you is that up until December, all the international rules were on physical biological material. That changed in December, and that changed because the decision on digital sequence information was part of a package deal. So we took members of the DSI Scientific Network, took this open access message, did a lot of outreach. It was a 2.5-week meeting. It was extraordinarily exhausting, but it was very rewarding to also engage in direct dialogue. What is so interesting is to look at the outcome in the high level segment, which is when the ministers sort of fly in from around the world, and then everybody gets nervous and scared because the ministers are coming to town, and how they turned all of this 2 weeks of negotiation into a package deal. So China had the presidency at COP15, and they basically chose 5 items: the global biodiversity framework itself, the monitoring framework, which monitors for the first time at a quantitative level progress on biodiversity loss in the planet, the capacity building plan to implement those first 2, resource mobilization, which basically means money to finance it all, and digital sequence information, benefit sharing. And because it's in this list, it became part of a take it or leave it deal. Because some people might have said to me, hey, why not just say no benefit sharing at all, leave it alone? And it's because this is how these things get negotiated. At the end of the day, parties get to take it or leave it. And they're going to take an environmental deal because we have a problem on the planet, and digital sequence information is part of the deal making. So the deal was made. Nikki has given me the signal that I am running very far out of time, and I've got another 10 slides. But ultimately, the document, the decision is great, I think, for science in that it really points out the importance of open access and being supportive, or at least not hindering research and innovation. And this question around whether the DSI agreement will be multilateral or bilateral is Nagoya Protocol-like, was a huge issue. And the UN is a text-based negotiation forum or procedures. And on Sunday morning, at the very end of the high-level segment, this was the document that came out that freaked me out. It might look totally boring, but it basically says, decides to establish, this is the DSI benefit sharing mechanism, without prejudice to national access and benefit sharing measures, including a multilateral fund. And this basically meant to me that both national rules could be made on digital data, and there could be also maybe some international rules. And luckily, there was some behind the scenes negotiation very late into the night. And ultimately, the final version was not that, but became a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information. So you can see this red part here, the without prejudice to national access and benefit sharing measures, so Nagoya-like, was deleted and became a purely multilateral mechanism. That might not look like a huge thing, but this is the thing that leads to tears when it's 4:30 in the morning. And it was really, I think, quite important. The other thing that happened in the last few months is that because international waters were free game, there's been a huge amount of concern in the environmental community that things like deep sea mining, the abuse of fisheries in international waters have led to a lot of impact on the high seas. And in fact, oh, sorry, I thought I was in the next one. This is just to say the DSI mechanism is not yet established. That's all we know. It's going to be a multilateral mechanism, and everything else is going to be decided later. This is where I thought I was. So the High Seas Treaty was negotiated in New York in March 2023. And basically what it means is, again, benefit sharing is part of the package deal. So in order to protect the high seas, to prevent deep sea mining, to protect the fisheries, there was also a deal in parallel on benefit sharing. And again, because of the precedent at CBD, DSI was brought in immediately from the very beginning. And it does fortunately recognize the value of open access to DSI, to fair scientific data. It offers actually the possibility for collections and even databases to recover the costs of hosting those things. But what's perhaps the most concerning about the BB&J agreement is that databases will need to prepare an aggregate report on access to BB&J source DSI, and users, including you in the room, would need to do a notification into a new entity called the BB&J Clearinghouse if and when BB&J source DSI is used. And it is still unclear exactly how this mechanism will work, but there will be a lot of decision and fun in the upcoming years. The WHO is also negotiating in parallel. They released a zero draft at the beginning of the year. Right now, it is focused on pathogens of pandemic potential. And the WHO doesn't use the term of art digital sequence information. They use the term of art genetic sequence data. That's what they like better. One of the extramural projects that I work on is the European Virus Archive. So we released an open letter this spring that analyzed the zero draft and sort of pointed out a couple of challenges that remain. First of all, the definition of pathogens is really quite narrow. It's limited to only pandemic potential, and there's no definition on how you would decide what is pandemic potential or not. Physical samples in DSI are treated the same way in terms of benefit sharing, meaning that right now in the current draft, and I hope this will change, if you access genetic sequence data from pathogens of pandemic potential, you would have to sign an SMTA, which is probably not the best way to handle millions or billions of data points. And there's also some unclarity in the text about open access and interoperability and the connections to the existing pathogen collections such as EVA. One of the biggest challenges with WHO is that academic stakeholders such as myself have very little ability to engage with the WHO process as compared to the environmental processes. My personal feeling on pathogen definitions, why did that happen? I might need technical help. Is it coming up now? Yeah, okay, now I'm going. Yeah, I think of it. when Guy posted on Twitter the launch of the new pathogen portal, which includes, over 200,000 pathogens, it sort of pops into my mind, well, you know what, science has kind of already decided what are pathogens. Why don't we actually use things like this to point policymakers to, and to say, this is a good legal scope for a new treaty. So putting ideas like this out there can sort of trigger thinking and discussion, and I actually think a broader scope would help, because right now pathogens are under the Nagoya Protocol. So if they come under WHO agreement, they could be handled a lot more simply. So the take-home messages. There are a lot of decisions that lie ahead. These are, I haven't even mentioned the FAO. There's a lot of decisions that will impact this, and your field, your work will change in the next decade. I'm not telling jokes. It's funny that you're laughing, because I actually am. I thought I was trying to scare you, but I'm glad you're laughing. The needs of the scientific community are that I think that there needs to be international standardization across the UN fora, and actually bringing this under the broader umbrella of the global biodiversity framework could be a solution. And the final slide, Nikki. Your take-home messages are that there are 4 United Nations fora that are making laws on benefit sharing from biological data, that there is a community of users that are engaged in this policy process, that use of sequence data from public databases might someday require a notification to a clearinghouse, the signing of a data use agreement, the change of terms of use to global open databases, the publication of provenance information, and reports from databases on origins, on users, on attribution to data. And all of that lies ahead. How exactly it will turn out, stay tuned, or follow me on Twitter if you want.